Okay, Talo Falava, Rob Pene here, and it is nice to meet you, the behind the scenes stories of busy professionals. Again, I am your host, Rob Pene. This episode, pretty special episode, but it's brought to you by Get Ghosted, a LinkedIn ghostwriting and profile management service. There's a lot of business on LinkedIn, but there's also a lot of people that kind of don't find LinkedIn sexy, so they don't even pay attention to it. Therefore, missed opportunities. So if you're one of those people, you need to breathe life into your LinkedIn profile. Go to the digitalwritingfirm.com and check out all the information you need for the LinkedIn ghostwriting and profile management service. With that, this is a treat. This is an absolute treat because when I started the podcast and I saw this name come through my email, I'm like, oh, that's Dr. Brassell. I actually took a class from him years ago when I was trying to get my teaching credential. And I remember the name because he was actually one of the better professors that I've ever sat under, ever, because entertaining, encouraging. In fact, heally known as the Jim Carrey in the education space because he's so entertaining, but also knowledgeable. He's spoken to over 3,500 audiences worldwide over the globe, right? 3,500 audiences. Imagine one audience has 3,500 people in it. Crazy. Written over 15 books, right? This guy's a genius. And I really want to dig into his story because I want to learn what made him and influenced him to be who he is because he's an absolute powerhouse. Dr. Brassell, I'm so grateful to have you. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. You're giving me a big head. I really appreciate all that you do. You're a motivated person, and I appreciate that you're spreading some joy across the world. We need a lot more of you and a lot less of that horrible show I was watching on TV the last week called The News. So keep on spreading the good word, my friend.
Yeah. To get us started, I like to ask this question just to get the wheels turning. But in the last 12 months, if you were to look at the last 12 months of your life and you were to turn that into a Netflix special, what would that movie be and what would you title it?
I think probably the movie of my life, I think the title's got to be called Pivots because I've been a jack of all trades and master of none. I'm always going from one thing to another. And I believe that the windshield's a lot bigger than the rearview mirror. So I'm always optimistic about the present and the future. And I have very little patience for the past.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And you've done a lot, and you're really known in the education space, the leadership space, and just in the speaking world. I'd like to dive into how did that all get started? Were you a great speaker when you were like 5 years old or something, or as an elementary? How did you get into speaking and teaching and leadership?
Before I get into that, I'll give you a story. So I was speaking, this is about 2018. I was in India speaking at a bunch of schools and got all the kids pumped up at one school. And afterwards, this one little boy looks up at me and he has tears in his eyes. He's about 6 years old. And I notice he's missing his left arm. And he looks up at me. He's, how can I succeed? And so I crouch down, I get to his eye level. And I say, when I was your age, I went to 18 different schools before I was 12 years old. Everybody called me stupid because I stuttered. And eventually I went to a school where a teacher took me one-on-one and worked on my stutter with me. She would actually sing things to me and I would sing them back, like the movie The King's Speech. And eventually I lost my stutter and I became a swan. But I looked at that little boy and I said, isn't it interesting that the little boy that everybody said was stupid because he couldn't talk right now gets paid ridiculous sums of money to travel the world to do what? And he gets the biggest grin on his face. He's speak. I'm like, don't let anybody ever tell you what you cannot do. So that's really been the guiding, I don't know what I'm even trying to say, a guiding point for my life. I've had lots of pivots. You probably don't even know this about me. Before I was a teacher over 30 years ago, I was a journalist. I covered President Bush Sr. on the 1992 presidential election, and I had the greatest job ever. I got to meet every editor of every major newspaper in America, and I got offered all these different jobs from different major dailies. And one daily, they offered me to do the city beat for $16,500 a year. Well, a friend told me they were hiring teachers in South Central Los Angeles and Compton for $25,000 a year. So, Rob, I became a teacher for the noblest of reasons, for the high pay. And I love teaching. I've taught all age levels. I can always say from preschoolers to rocket scientists. I eventually started teaching people like you at the university. When I still am a faculty advisor at Cal State Teach, where I help people get their credentials. But then in 2005, my wife and I attended a real estate seminar, which turned out to be a scam. and we lost everything. And I could sit there and focus on all the negatives, but I'm a positive person. So I look at all the good things that happen. First of all, my wife is my soulmate. She stuck by me when she didn't need to. She's a great human being. Second of all, I no longer place so much emphasis on money because I realize now you can lose it all in just a second.
Mm.
Third, I try not to judge other people because if I was somebody looking at what I did, I would have said, you deserve that. But now, Rob, I realize if you don't know everything about a person, you don't know anything about a person.
Mm.
Fourth, I became a Christian, which I'm always embarrassed to say, but the more I read the Bible, I'm not the first screw up to find Jesus. And fifth, and this is the most important thing for this conversation, was I didn't want to have to file bankruptcy. And my accountant at the time said, in order not to file bankruptcy, you have to make this much more money a year. So I started speaking on the side and I hit the number right on the number that he gave me. The next year, Rob, he gave me a much higher number and I hit that number right on the number. So in year three, I thought maybe I should set a higher number. And basically, during one of the worst economic downturns in American history, I was able to build up a speaking business, which was very prosperous up until 2020, when a thing called COVID came out. And people asked me, well, how's your speaking business doing? I'm like, wow, the way I lost 200 speaking engagements overnight because they just shut down the world, I had to make another pivot. And so for years, people had asked me to coach them in speaking, and I always resisted because I think you know this
Mm.
about me, Rob. I have a very high standard for my students. I'm going to encourage you, but I'm also going to keep you accountable, and I want you to succeed. Failure is not an option. I love the movie Apollo 13. Failure is not an option. I need you to succeed. And it's one of the reasons I left teaching was because I could have, of my 33 students, 31 of them could be above grade level at the end of the year, but I always focus on the two that I didn't get there because I felt personally accountable for that. It's been a real treat because I work with entrepreneurs and business leaders, people just like you and your audience, Rob. And I find that they're highly motivated and I'm actually loving it. And so that is a very long answer to your short question, but I guess the movie is going to be called Pivots, coming soon on Paramount Plus.
Yes, Peacock and YouTube TV, all of the above. The stuttering problem was probably a big issue. And when did you realize you conquered it? And then at that pivotal point, did you also realize that you had an affinity towards communication in general, or did that come later?
I've never met a microphone that I didn't like, Rob. As far as conquering it, you'll notice that I still haven't conquered it. I get excited. The reason I always had a stutter is I get excited and I speak quickly and it would slow me down. And I've mastered it most of the time, but I still, when I get excited, and that's why I always try to slow down my speech because I have to consciously think about what I'm saying.
Now, where did the personality and the character come from? Because you're very entertaining, you're joyous, right? And some of the stories and the jokes you tell, it hits home. Did that come early and during the earlier kind of struggle period, or did you find it later?
I was always blessed. I had great parents. Both of my parents were present in the home my entire life. My father's very quiet, soft spoken, probably the smartest person I ever met. If I have any brains, it came from dad. But mom, she was an actress, and people think I talk a lot. I never had a chance growing up. My mother is constantly, she's never received a piece of mail that she did not feel compelled to read aloud to every single person in the room. She'll be like, hey, Danny, remember Mrs. Huffnagel? She died 4 years before you were born. I just got a letter from her daughter. Let me read it to you. I have no interest in this whatsoever. But she was always very entertaining, very energetic. I've always had an optimistic outlook. When you have a mom that every morning wakes you up by singing in the rain, good morning, it drove me nuts. And now that I'm a parent, I realize I do the same dang thing to my kids.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I know that the college timeline is usually the formative years for people when they learn skill sets and all that. Can you walk me through what that was like for you so I can get a picture of how things were for you like during your college years?
College was great for me. It's an interesting story. All I wanted to do was go to Yale when I was in high school. I had the grades, I had the test scores, I had the letters of recommendation, I had all of the school activities. And I remember on a Tuesday afternoon, I got my rejection letter from Yale. At the time, I was a pretty good
Hmm.
football player, and I'd been recruited by a lot of universities to play football. And I was a stubborn 17-year-old. So I went alphabetically down the list and I looked for the very first university without a football team, which was American University in Washington, D.C. I got in. It was a total fluke. It turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life because I fell in love with Washington, D.C. I made all kinds of great friends. It gave me a different perspective because I was coming from the Western United States. I think you need those different perspectives from different places. And so college was very formative for me. And yeah, I wouldn't change a thing. I'm not a person that lives with regrets. I'm a person that looks at everything and it's just a stepping stone for what's next.
Nice. And then from there, obviously, it dovetailed into working with the politicians and in that space. And then you wrote some books.
Mm-hmm.
Books is huge. Obviously, we learned from some of them. Where did the idea for your first book come from, and what was it?
My very first book I co-wrote with a professor who his contribution to the book was his biography and nothing else. Anything he ever wrote, I questioned if he was actually writing it. These were academic books. My first books were all about reading strategy. You know that with me, reading's my passion, getting kids. I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go turn on the TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to do it because they love it. And there's simple strategies I've used with all of my students and how I train parents and teachers how to get their students excited about reading. So I wrote a lot of reading books. I wrote some books about my teaching experiences. And then lately, I've been having a lot of fun. I wrote the book, Leadership Begins with Motivations. When I taught middle school, I was the only teacher in the school that none of my students were ever tardy. And the reason was because I always started off class by reading a lot of Paul Harvey stories. I'm much older than you, Rob. You probably don't remember Paul Harvey, but when I was a kid, every day at 12:15 on the radio, Paul Harvey would come on and say, I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story. And for 5 minutes, you're trying to figure out who's he talking about or what's the business or place he's talking about. And my students absolutely love these things. But the problem with Paul Harvey is a lot of his stories are about like Sears and Roebuck. Kid today doesn't even know what Sears Roebuck is. And so when I wrote Leadership Begins with Motivation, I wrote this book because I wanted to update it with people that the kids were more familiar with, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and stuff like that. After I wrote that book, I read it and I realized completely unintentionally, most of my stories were of white male Americans. And so the latest book that I wrote is called Misfits and Crackpots. And this book, most of the stories in this book are about like women, minorities, and international people. Because I think kids need to see those different types of role models. Actually, really another motivation for Rob was I was walking through a Barnes and Noble one day through the young adult section. And every book was about date rape or suicide or dystopian society. And I'm like, no wonder teenagers are screwed up. They're reading nothing but negative stuff. And so I wanted to give them a book about here's how people just like you were able to rise well above what their expectations or anybody else's expectations were for them.
And you co-founded a program that's one of the leading reading enrichment programs all over the world. But you have a really interesting approach because it's not just teaching the children how to fall in love with reading, but it's actually teaching the parents to buy in as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I used to run a nonprofit called Real Dads Read, and I used to always challenge dads. I'm like, hey, dads, you want to know why your kids like football so much? It's the only time you spend with them. If you spent your time reading to your kids, the kids would want to be readers. My pastor used to say something which I loved. He'd say, parents, you have the greatest home field advantage in the history of the planet. You could be the worst parent ever, and your kid doesn't know it. To them, you're just mom or dad. And I think the same goes for teachers. You could be a bad teacher, but all the kids in your classroom, you're their teacher. That's what they think. And so it's really important to me. My program, in just over 2 months, I show parents how to get their kids to read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. So I'll give you a couple of ninja strategies. President Bush Sr., over 30 years ago, signed a very important law in this country. It says every television set in America has to have closed captioning. So the first strategy I share with parents is turn on the closed captioning on your TV. And when I'm doing a live training, parents will ask, wait a sec, if the show is in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? I'm like, well, that's a fair point, but let me make a point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles? It's actually very difficult to do. Your brain is directed towards the text, and there's actual research that proves this point. If you look at reading test scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every single country on the planet except for one. The country where the kids watch the most TV also has the highest reading scores. It's
Mm.
Finland. And people always
Mm.
ask me, how can that be? I'm like, it's because Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they have to do is they import all these old American sitcoms like Good Times and Happy Days. They have to translate it into Finnish. The kids are sitting there reading the television all the time. So that's an easy strategy that any parent
Wow.
can implement in their home. There's two numbers that are the cornerstone of the program. Those numbers are 67 and 20. And so a lot of people will tell you it takes 21 days to change a habit. And to those people, I say, show me the research on that. It's a completely fabricated number. I know exactly where it comes from. It comes from a wonderful book written in 1960 called Psycho-Cybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. Now, in the preface of that book, Dr. Maltz was a plastic surgeon, and he noted in the preface that he noticed that most of his patients, it took them about 21 days to get used to their new faces. Well, a lot of self-help gurus, personal development maestros, people that I respect, by the way, they started telling people it takes 21 days to change a habit. There's absolutely no research to demonstrate that. So in 2009, the University of London did a habit study to see how long it takes people to form habits. And they determined it took anywhere from 18 to 254 days to change a habit. And the average was 66 days. I don't like the number 66, so I threw in a bonus day, 67 days to change a habit. And it depends on the type of habit you're trying to change. So for example, if you want to drink a glass of water before breakfast, that might take 18 days to form that habit. But if you want to quit smoking, that could take 254 days. And here's why this is very important for everybody to understand this, Rob. Let's say you go on a diet, you follow it religiously for 21 days, but then on day 22, you fall off the wagon. You blame yourself. That's wrong because the research shows it takes at least 3 times longer than that to form a habit. So that's the first number I always point out to parents. Our program is designed 67 days, just over 2 months to get your kid reading more. Second number is 20. So researchers were looking at students around the world. They wanted to figure out what helps successful students succeed. And they stumbled upon a characteristic that floored them. It was the number of minutes spent reading outside of school. So they looked at the low kids, the average kids, and the high kids. So the low kids, 20th percentile, some of your worst students, F students, bottom feeders, they average less than a minute a day reading outside of school. That didn't surprise anybody. It's probably why they're at the bottom of the class. But the next number shocked researchers. The kids in the middle of the class, the 70th percentile, C students, your average students, they average 9.6 minutes a day reading outside of school. So when I'm doing a live training, this is when the audience gets real quiet and the first parent raises a hand and says, wait a second, are you saying if I can get my kid to read 10 minutes a day at home, I can take him from an F to a C? That's exactly what I'm saying. There is a lot of research to support this. But the next number floored the researchers. The kids near the top of the class, 90th percentile, A-minus students, some of your best students, do they spend 3 hours a day reading outside of school for fun? No. Do they average an hour a day? No. The average was just over 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes a day, that's what we're aiming for when we're parents. And there's 2 things that I always love to tell people. First of all, those minutes don't have to be consecutive, so you can do 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there. Second of all, the research shows us that being read aloud to is just as powerful as reading on your own. And so I'll suggest to parents, if it takes you 10 minutes to drive your kids to and from school every single day, you just covered your 20 minutes if you put in an audiobook back and forth. There's all kinds of easy ways to do that. It's the 20 minutes. I have 3 kids, and when the kids were really little, I created a habit for the kids was I believe television's here to stay. And so my kids are allowed to watch the TV, but the price of admission is they have to bring me something to read. And so when they were little, they'd bring me picture books and I'd read aloud the picture book to them. Now they're all older, late teens, 20s. And so they'll bring me like their iPad or a newspaper article or something. They're still doing it because it's a habit. It's all about how do we model positive habits for our kids. If you're sitting there cursing in front of your kids and you wonder why your kids are cursing all the time, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. So again, that's a very long answer, but this is what I do with parents. And it doesn't really take a lot to get kids excited. Here's the other thing I always tell people. When I was teaching 2nd grade, I had a little boy named Kiara, and Kiara's 1st grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. I'm like, well, thank you for that. Yeah, Kiara, who don't know nothing, this is a long time ago, Rob, he comes into my classroom one day, he's like, hey, Mr. Brassell, Barkley last night, he had 18 points, 16 boards. I'm like, thank you, Kiara, because from that day forward, every day after lunch, I'd sit them on my lap. We'd read the LA Times sports page together. And by the end of the year, Kiara was one of my best readers.
Yeah.
Do I think Shakespeare's important? Yes. But before you get the kid to Shakespeare, you got to get them hooked. I always tell this to parents. The little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to become a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare, but you got to get the kid hooked first. And so we're always looking for ways. I used to volunteer downtown at a juvenile detention facility for teenage girls, and they said, there's no way you're going to get these girls reading. It took me a week, Rob. And the way I was able to get them to read was, if you read in the back of Us magazine, there's this thing called the Fashion Police, where it's all these comedians ripping on celebrity outfits on the red carpet. These girls could not get enough of that. They were going crazy, laughing and stuff. Hey, that's how we got them hooked. I've gotten a lot of boys hooked on reading by starting with football cards, whatever turns them on. Let's figure. The research is also very clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. And again, being read aloud to. I work a lot with dyslexics. A lot of people don't realize that 60% of reading disabilities are usually dyslexia. Dyslexia, like all reading disabilities, is curable. But what you have to understand is dyslexics tend to process information a lot better with their ears. And so rather than forcing the kid to read on their own, I'm giving them Audible books all the time. And they're avid. You look at some of the most successful people in society. In business, you got people like Sir Richard Branson is dyslexic. In entertainment, people like Tom Cruise and Whoopi Goldberg and Sylvester Stallone are dyslexic. George Washington was dyslexic. So you're in good company. You know this about me. I hate people telling me you can't. The people that tell you can't, they just don't know how to. There's always a way. We always find that way. I'm sorry, I get passionate about this.
This is great. This is great. So for parents that are interested in finding these programs, do they have to go to a school or a school district to ask about them, or they can just find you online? How are they able to identify where that program is and ask questions and learn about it?
As a thank you for listening to me, Rob, I wanted to give everybody a couple of freebies. So if they go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. This is a book, I wrote it for an elementary school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation, demonstrates the same concept. And you read that in 5 minutes. I'm also going to give everybody access to a 5-day reading challenge I did online last summer for about 700 parents around the world, where every day for an hour, I give you exactly the same types of strategies that you can get in my Reading Habit program. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get kids excited about reading, because the more excited you are to read, the more likely you are to read. And the more you read, the better you get. So you can get all that at freegiftfromdanny.com. And Rob, this has just been a treat. I'm so excited to see you, and I love all that you're doing, and just keep on doing it, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Is there a LinkedIn or a Instagram that you want to send them to, or can they just go right to your website and they'll be able to find everything there?
Believe me, if they go to freegiftfromdanny.com, they'll be on some kind of email list for the rest of eternity, I'm pretty sure. But if they just need to know my name, I'm Danny Brassell. My last name's really easy to remember how to spell. Spelled like Brassell. No, I never took any grief over that as a child. So Danny Brassell. But yeah, if you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm sure we'll spam you for the rest of eternity.
Yep, that works. We like spam. Yep, spam and rice. Spam and rice. Cool. It was a pleasure. This was definitely a treat. There's a lot of gems in here. I think I really like the part of you growing up and facing that adversity and giving them some tools on how to overcome it. So I appreciate this and so grateful for you to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. God bless.
You too.